Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma. March 1945. The train platform smelled of diesel and spring rain, and 15-year-old Dieter Koch stepped onto American soil with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He'd been told Americans were savages who tortured prisoners, especially the young ones. He'd been told to expect cruelty, starvation, casual violence. Instead, an American guard handed him a chocolate bar, real chocolate, wrapped in paper that crinkled, and said something in English that sounded almost kind. Dieter stared at the chocolate, at the guard's face, at the platform where other boy soldiers stood frozen in the same confusion. Everything he'd been taught was already crumbling, and he hadn't even left the station. They'd been called up in the final desperate months, when Germany scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel and found boys barely old enough to shave. Dieter Koch was 15, from a small town outside Dresden, had been in uniform for 4 months before American forces captured his unit during the Rhine crossing in March 1945. He de-fired his rifle twice, both times, without hitting anything, both times too terrified to aim properly before surrendering to American soldiers who looked almost as young as he felt, but carried themselves with the confidence of people who knew they were winning. Hans Richter was 16, tall for his age, but thin as a fence post, from Hamburg. He'd watched his city burn from Allied bombing, had seen things no child should see, and when conscription came, he'd gone almost willingly, because staying home meant watching slow destruction without purpose. At least the military offered structure, duty, something to do besides wait for the next air raid siren. He'd been captured the same day as Dieter, in the same chaotic rout when German lines collapsed and officers fled and boys with rifles stood in fields wondering what they were supposed to do now. Klaus Zimmermann was 14, the youngest, small enough that his uniform hung loose despite attempts to alter it, baby-faced enough that American soldiers had initially refused to believe he was military rather than civilian caught in wrong place. But his papers were authentic, his service number was valid, and he wore the uniform of the Wehrmacht's Volkssturm militia, that last-ditch conscription of children and old men, when proper soldiers had all been consumed by war as insatiable hunger. Klaus had been in uniform 6 weeks, had received perhaps 40 hours of training, and had fired his rifle exactly once during a training exercise where he missed the target by 3 meters and felt secretly relieved because hitting something meant he might eventually have to hit a person. The group traveling to Camp Tonkawa numbered 37 boys between 14 and 17 captured during Germany's collapse, now being shipped across the Atlantic to Oklahoma, where the American military needed someone to manage them and hadn't quite figured out what protocols applied to child prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions covered combatants, but how did you classify teenagers who'd been drafted, given weapons, and told to fight for a regime that was clearly dying? Were they soldiers? Victims? Both? The Atlantic crossing had taken 2 weeks, and the boys had spent most of it in the hold of a transport ship, seasick and scared, uncertain what awaited them in America. The propaganda had been explicit: Americans tortured prisoners, particularly young ones, making examples of children to demoralize German forces. The propaganda officers had shown photographs supposedly proving American cruelty, had shared testimonies from soldiers who'd allegedly survived American captivity, though nobody ever met these survivors personally. The message was clear: surrender meant death or worse, and young prisoners should expect no mercy. But the crossing itself had contradicted that narrative. The boys were fed regularly, not lavishly, but adequately, more than field rations, better than anything they'd eaten in months. American guards were professional, bored even, treating child prisoners more like inconvenient cargo than hated enemies. When Klaus got violently seasick, an American medic treated him with the same care he'd show anyone, giving him medicine that helped, checking on him twice daily, showing no sign of the cruelty propaganda had promised. The train from New York to Oklahoma had taken 3 days, crossing a continent so vast It made Germany seem like a garden plot. Dieter had pressed his face to the window whenever possible, watching America unfold cities that hadn't been bombed, farms that looked prosperous, civilians who moved without the constant fear that had characterized German life for years. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and overwhelming. This was the enemy. The nation, they'd been told, was weak and decadent, yet everything visible suggested strength and abundance beyond anything propaganda had prepared them for. The platform at Tonkawa materialized from morning mist like something from a dream. Small town, single-story buildings, water tower visible against flat Oklahoma sky. Everything painted in colors that seemed too bright after years of German gray. The boys descended from the train in uncertain cluster, military discipline forgotten in confusion and fear. Just teenagers in ill-fitting uniforms, wondering what happened next. Captain James Morrison, the camp commander, stood at the platform with his staff, watching the boys arrive. He was 38, had 2 sons roughly the same age as these prisoners, and felt uncomfortable about the whole situation. Their children. He'd told his superiors when informed he'd be receiving juvenile POWs. The response had been bureaucratic. They're enemy combatants who wore uniforms and carried weapons. Treat them according to Geneva Conventions and use judgment about age-appropriate accommodations. Morrison had requested clarification about what age-appropriate meant for 15-year-old prisoners of war. No clarification had arrived. So he'd made his own decisions. The boys would be housed separately from adult prisoners. They'd attend educational classes. They'd receive adequate nutrition and medical care. They'd be treated firmly, but not harshly, with recognition that children forced into military service deserve different handling than career soldiers who'd chosen warfare. His staff had questioned these decisions coddling the enemy. Some said, showing weakness, failing to maintain proper distance between captors and captives. Morrison had overridden objections with commander as authority. WWII treat them as we hope our own captured sons would be treated. That's the standard. The chocolate bar moment wasn't planned. It was improvisation by Sergeant Davis, a farm boy from Kansas, who'd been instructed to help with intake processing. He'd seen the boys descend from the train, seen their terror, poorly masked by attempts at military bearing, and remembered his own teenage brothers back home. He'd reached into his pocket, found a Hershey bar he'd been saving, and handed it to the first boy off the train, Dieter Koch, whose hands shook so badly he almost dropped it. Dieter stared at the chocolate as if it might be explosive. American guards distributed chocolate? That was madness. That was propaganda in reverse. That was either kindness so unexpected it felt dangerous, or trap so sophisticated he could undetect the mechanism. He looked at Sergeant Davis, at the other boys crowding behind him, at the chocolate bar melting slightly in his trembling hand. Finally, Hans whispered in German, "Either it's safe or it's poisoned and we die. But at least we die having tasted chocolate." Dieter tore the wrapper and took a bite. The sweetness hit his tongue like a memory from before the war, rich, pure, and possibly good after years of ersatz everything. He'd forgotten food could taste like this, forgotten that pleasure existed beyond survival. He chewed slowly, swallowed, waited for poison symptoms that never came. Instead, there was just chocolate, real chocolate, given freely by an enemy guard who was smiling at him with something that looked almost like kindness. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that Dieter felt dizzy, though that might have been low blood sugar rather than philosophical confusion. The processing took 3 hours medical examinations, delousing showers, uniform exchange, paperwork documenting names and capture details. The American staff conducted everything with efficient professionalism, treating the boys firmly but without cruelty, maintaining authority without inflicting degradation. The showers were private, the medical examinations were respectful, and the new clothes American prison uniforms, marked with POW stencils, were clean and properly sized, someone having anticipated that children needed different dimensions than adult prisoners. Klaus couldn't believe the showers. hot water. Actual hot water, abundant and clean, lasting more than 30 seconds. In Germany, hot water had disappeared years ago, bathing reduced to cold sponging when water was available at all. He stood under the stream until Sergeant Davis tapped on the stall and said something in English that probably meant, "Time is up, son." Klaus dried with a towel that was rough but clean, feeling transformed by simple hygiene like washing away, had removed more than just dirt, had removed some of the fear and deprivation and trauma that had accumulated over years of war. The medical examination revealed what Captain Morrison had suspected: severe malnutrition. The camp physician, Dr. Elizabeth Parker, documented heights and weights that painted a picture of systematic starvation. Geider was 5'7" and weighed 98 pounds. Hans was 5'10" and weighed 105 pounds. Klaus was 5'3" and weighed 84 pounds. All showed signs of vitamin deficiencies, untreated injuries, chronic exhaustion. Dr. Parker made notes that would later become part of military reports about conditions in Germany's final months, about a regime so desperate it had conscripted starving children and sent them to war without proper food or training or any chance of survival. The meal that followed was served in a separate dining area from adult prisoners, another of Morrison's accommodations for age. The boys sat at long tables, uncertain and silent, as American cooks served food that exceeded anything propaganda had led them to expect. Beef stew, bread with butter, green beans, milk, actual milk, white and cold and tasting like childhood memories from before rationing, had turned everything into substitutes and scarcity. Dieter ate slowly, his stomach protesting rich food after months of deprivation, his mind unable to process the contradiction between propaganda promises and present reality. He'd been told Americans starved prisoners, yet here was abundance. He'd been told Americans tortured children, yet here was mercy. He'd been told Americans were weak and cruel, yet here was strength expressed through restraint and cruelty absent, despite every justification for it. Hans ate mechanically, his tall frame needing calories, even as his mind struggled to accept their source. He kept thinking about propaganda sessions where officers had shown photographs of American prisoner camps, where starvation and torture were presented as documented fact. But those photographs had been grainy, unclear, possibly fabricated. This meal was concrete, undeniable, real. If propaganda had lied about this, what else had been lies? The question opened chasms Hans wasn't ready to explore. Klaus couldn't finish his portion. His shrunken stomach simply couldn't accommodate food his body desperately needed. He sat staring at half-eaten stew, feeling tears prick his eyes, because wasting food felt like sign, because abundance felt like punishment after years of scarcity, because kindness from enemies hurt worse than cruelty would have. An American cook noticed, came over, said something gentle in English, and wrapped the remaining food for Klaus to have later. The gesture was small, but overwhelming recognition that prisoners were human, that children needed care, that even enemies deserved basic compassion. The living quarters were simple but clean wooden barracks with bunks, thin mattresses, lockers for personal items they didn't have. The windows had bars, but also screens against insects, suggesting concern for prisoner comfort beyond minimum security requirements. The floors were swept, the walls were painted, and someone had hung a bulletin board with camp rules translated into German, acknowledging that prisoners needed to understand expectations rather than just be punished for violations. Captain Morrison addressed them through a translator, a German-speaking American corporal who'd grown up in Milwaukee's German community. The captain's message was straightforward. You're prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protection. You'll be treated fairly but firmly. You'll attend school, perform light work duties, receive adequate food and medical care. The war is essentially over. Germany is defeated. Your job now is to survive, maintain your health, Prepare for eventual repatriation to whatever Germany becomes after reconstruction. The words landed like physical blows. Germany is defeated. None of the boys had fully accepted that reality, despite the evidence. Surrender had been individual act, their units collapse rather than national catastrophe. But hearing it stated plainly by an American officer made it undeniable. The regime they'd been told was invincible had lost. The victory they'd been promised was myth. Everything they'd sacrificed, childhood, innocence, normalcy, had been for nothing. Dieter felt anger flash hot in his chest, not at the Americans, surprisingly, but at the regime that had lied to them, that had sent children to war, that had promised victory while planning nothing but prolonged dying. He looked around the barracks at other boys, showing similar emotional cascades, and wondered how many felt the same fury at being betrayed by their own leadership more completely than they'd been defeated by enemies. That evening, lying on his bunk in American prison barracks in Oklahoma, Dieter tried to process the day. He'd expected beatings and received chocolate. He'd expected starvation and received beef stew. He'd expected torture and received medical care. Every expectation based on propaganda had been wrong. The Americans weren't savages. They were professional soldiers following rules, showing mercy despite having every reason for vengeance. Hans climbed into the bunk above Dieter, and whispered in the darkness, "Do you think they all like this? The Americans? Or did we just get lucky with these particular guards?" Dieter considered before responding. "I think maybe we've been lied to about everything. Maybe American cruelty was propaganda. Maybe our invincibility was propaganda. Maybe all of it was lies." Klaus, in a nearby bunk, was crying quietly, not from fear or pain, but from emotional overload, from relief and grief and confusion, all mixed together into something impossible to untangle. He was 14 years old, 3,000 miles from home, a prisoner of war in a country he'd been taught to hate, and the hardest part was in captivity. It was realizing that enemies were treating him better than his own regime, that strangers were showing more care than leaders who'd claimed to be protecting him. Morning came with Oklahoma sunrise, and with it an announcement that stunned the boys completely. They would attend school. Not work details or punishment duty, but actual school. Captain Morrison had determined that children prisoners of war needed education more than their labor value justified ignoring their development. So he'd organized classes in English, mathematics, history, geography standard curriculum, adapted for adolescent POWs who'd had their education interrupted by conscription. The classroom was a converted storage building, furnished with desks and chalkboards and maps that showed a world the boys didn't fully recognize. Germany shown in colors that indicated occupation zones, territories divided among Allied powers, a country that no longer existed as they'd known it. The teacher was Mrs. Sarah Thompson, a local woman in her 50s whose son was serving in the Pacific, who volunteered for this unusual assignment, partly from patriotism and partly from recognition that these were children despite being enemies. She started with English basics, assuming correctly that most boys had minimal facility with the language. "Good morning," she said clearly, gesturing for them to repeat. The boys mumbled the phrase with German accents thick enough to make comprehension difficult. She smiled patiently and repeated, "Good morning. Let's try again." Slowly, haltingly, they practiced greeting that had nothing to do with warfare or captivity, just polite social exchange between humans who happened to speak different languages. Dieter found himself engaged despite initial resistance. Learning felt normal, felt like something from before the war, when life had included school and homework and concerns about grades rather than survival. He'd been a decent student before conscription, had liked mathematics and geography, had imagined maybe becoming engineer or architect. Those dreams had seemed impossible after conscription, after seeing combat, after accepting that his future would be whatever the regime assigned. But sitting in this classroom, practicing English pronunciation, He felt something almost like hope, that maybe there was future beyond war, beyond captivity, beyond the ashes of everything he'd known. Hans struggled more, his height making him look older, his experiences making him feel ancient. Yet the education level was appropriate for his actual age rather than his apparent maturity. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to learn the enemy's language, didn't want to adapt to captivity's routines. But resistance was exhausting, and eventually he found himself participating, despite intentions not to, found himself raising his hand to answer questions, found himself caring about getting pronunciations correct, even though he told himself he wouldn't care about anything American. Klaus thrived. He was youngest, most adaptable, least hardened by propaganda and combat. He absorbed English vocabulary with speed that surprised Mrs. Thompson, who noted in her reports that some children's minds seemed almost grateful for normal intellectual stimulation after trauma and deprivation. Klaus liked having correct answers, liked the structure of grammar rules, liked that this classroom felt safe in ways nothing had felt safe for years. He could focus on learning irregular verbs instead of wondering if he'd survive the day, and that trade felt like luxury beyond measure. Afternoons brought light work assignments. Captain Morrison had determined that some productivity was necessary, both for camp operations and for prisoner morale, but that children shouldn't perform hard labor. So the boys were assigned to gardening, kitchen assistance, maintenance tasks that taught skills while avoiding exploitation. The Geneva Conventions required POW labor, but also regulated its intensity, and Morrison interpreted those regulations conservatively when dealing with adolescents. Dieter was assigned to the camp garden, where vegetables were grown to supplement food supplies. He worked alongside Private Johnson, a guard from Iowa who'd grown up farming and treated the garden with serious respect. Johnson demonstrated proper planting technique, explained crop rotation principles, showed genuine pride in producing good vegetables. The interaction was surreal enemy soldier, teaching prisoner agricultural skills as if they were colleagues rather than captor and captive. Johnson spoke minimal German and Dieter spoke minimal English, but they communicated through gestures and shared work. And gradually Dieter learned not just gardening, but something deeper, that Americans weren't so different from Germans, that soldiers on both sides were mostly ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, that the enemy's status was constructed and could be deconstructed through simple acts of cooperation. Hans worked in the kitchen under supervision of the camp cooks, learning food preparation on scale he'd never imagined. The quantities were staggering, cooking for 600 prisoners and staff required, logistics and organization that impressed his methodical mind. He watched American efficiency with grudging respect, saw how systems functioned when properly resourced, understood that military effectiveness came not from ideology or propaganda, but from practical competence in logistics, supply chains, and operational planning. The head cook, Sergeant Martinez from Texas, treated Hans like an apprentice rather than a prisoner. He explained techniques, demonstrated proper knife skills, shared wisdom about kitchen management that had nothing to do with warfare. "You've got good hands," Martinez said in simple English that Hans could mostly follow. "You work clean, work smart. After the war, you could be a cook. Good trade, always need cooks." The suggestion that Hans had a future, that skills learned in captivity might have value in whatever came after, felt revolutionary. Klaus was assigned to the camp library, a small room with donated books, magazines and newspapers that prisoners could access during free time. His job was organizing, cataloging, keeping the space tidy. The American librarian, Mrs. Davis, was Sergeant Davis's wife, a volunteer who believed literacy was fundamental human right that didn't disappear during wartime. She showed Klaus the organizational system, taught him library science basics, treated him like young assistant rather than enemy prisoner. The library had German books classics, mostly carefully vetted to exclude propaganda, but include literature that represented German cultural achievement without regime ideology. Klaus found Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, Hess, writers he'd heard about, but never read because the regime had been suspicious of literature that wasn't explicitly ideological. He spent spare moments reading, discovering his own culture through books in enemy captivity, finding identity that had nothing to do with the regime or the war or the defeat. By the second week, the boys were allowed to write letters home-censored, limited to 1 page, restricted to personal news rather than military or political content. The permission itself was surprising. The difficulty of actually writing was overwhelming. What could they say? How could they describe captivity that was more comfortable than military service had been? Treatment by enemies that was more humane than treatment by their own leadership? Gradual recognition that everything they'd been taught was wrong? Dieter wrote to his mother in Dresden, assuming she'd survived, though he had no confirmation. He kept the letter simple. I am well. I am safe. The Americans treat us fairly. Please do not worry for me. Focus on your own survival, and I will return when circumstances allow. I love you. He didn't mention chocolate or beef stew or hot showers or English classes. Couldn't figure out how to explain that captivity felt almost like relief after the war's final desperate months. Hans wrote to his father, last known address in Hamburg, not knowing if the city even existed anymore after years of bombing. His letter was more detailed, describing the camp, the work, the routine, trying to convey that he was managing, that survival remained possible, that hope hadn't completely died. He wrote, "The Americans follow rules. They feed us adequately. They treat us as prisoners, but not as animals. I am learning English and working in their kitchen. I think about home constantly, but I am surviving." Klaus wrote to both parents, his handwriting childish despite attempts at maturity, his words revealing his age despite trying to sound grown up. "I miss you every day," he wrote. "I miss home and my room and the park where we used to walk. But I am safe here. The Americans have been kind. They don't hurt us. They give us school and food, and they don't make us afraid. I know Germany lost the war. I hope you are safe. I hope I can see you again someday. Your son, Klaus." The letters were mailed through Red Cross channels, and responses would take months if they came at all. But writing them provided connection to lives beyond captivity, reminded the boys they'd been someone before becoming prisoners, gave hope that they might be someone again after. The American postal clerk who processed the letters read German and was moved by their simple honesty, their childish attempts to reassure parents while barely holding together themselves. He made sure every letter was properly sent, adding official notes that confirmed the boys were alive and reasonably well, knowing parents on the other end would be desperate for any news. Not everyone adapted successfully. 2 boys from the group older, more ideologically committed, less willing to accept that propaganda had been lies, struggled profoundly with cognitive dissonance between expectations and reality. Werner Schmidt, 17, had been in the regime's youth organizations since age 10, had absorbed ideology so completely it formed his identity. American mercy threatened everything he built his self-conception around, and rather than accept reality, he retreated into denial and anger. He refused to attend classes, refused to work, spent days sitting in the barracks, staring at walls or shouting propaganda slogans at anyone who'd listen. "The Americans are deceiving us," he'd insist. "This comfortable treatment is psychological warfare designed to make us betray Germany." True patriots would resist, would maintain discipline, would refuse to be corrupted by enemy kindness. His intensity frightened some of the younger boys, reminded them of the regime's hardness, represented everything they were gradually learning to question. Captain Morrison tried patience first allowed Werner his resistance, provided space for adjustment, hoped time would soften certainties. But Werner's influence was spreading, creating faction among prisoners, between those adapting and those clinging to ideology. Morrison finally intervened by separating Werner to isolated housing, not as punishment, but as recognition that his presence was preventing others' healing. The separation broke something in Werner. Alone, without audience for his ideology, without peers to reinforce propaganda certainties, he confronted reality he'd been avoiding. The Americans had been kind. The food had been real. The mercy hadn't been deception. Everything he'd believed was wrong, and accepting that meant accepting he'd been used, manipulated, lied to by people he'd trusted completely. The psychological collapse was devastating to witness. Werner spent 3 days barely eating, barely speaking, just sitting and staring as his worldview shattered and reformed around undeniable truth. When he emerged from isolation, he was different, quieter, humbler, broken in ways that might eventually heal, but would never quite disappear. He apologized to the other boys, to Captain Morrison, to the guards he'd insulted. He started attending classes, participating in work details, engaging with his captivity rather than resisting it. But the brightness was gone from his eyes, replaced by sadness that came from learning you'd been betrayed by those who declaimed to be protecting you. Dieter watched Werner's transformation with mixed emotions. Relief that the ideological pressure was gone, that they could adapt without being called traitors. But also grief for what Werner represented all the boys who'd believed, who'd sacrificed, who'd given everything to cause that had been exposed as false. They were all Werner in some way, all recovering from propaganda's systematic lies, all learning to build identity on something more honest than ideology. December 1945 brought the first Christmas in captivity, and the camp administration organized celebration that exceeded anything the boys expected. A tree was erected in their barracks, decorated with handmade ornaments the boys created in craft sessions. Mrs. Thompson organized carols singing in German, allowing them to maintain cultural traditions without ideological content. The camp chaplain conducted services that were Christian rather than political, focused on hope and peace rather than nationalism or revenge. The Christmas meal was extraordinary turkey, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pie for dessert, portions generous enough that some boys couldn't finish. Captain Morrison addressed them before eating, his words translated carefully. Today we celebrate hope. The war has ended. The dying has stopped. You boys survived when many didn't. You have futures ahead of you, opportunities to rebuild lives and contribute to a better world. This meal is recognition that you more than prisoners. You young men who deserve chance to become who you meant to be. Dieter felt tears sting his eyes during that speech. His father had died on the Eastern Front 3 years earlier. His older brother had been lost at sea when his U-boat disappeared. He'd been conscripted at 15, had fought in a war he didn't understand for causes that were revealed as false, and now he sat in enemy captivity eating Christmas dinner while an American captain told him he had a future worth hoping for. The emotional complexity was overwhelming: grief for losses, guilt for survival, gratitude for mercy, hope for what might come next. Hans had similar thoughts running through his mind. Hamburg was probably rubble. His family might be dead. Everything he'd known was destroyed. But sitting in this warm barracks, belly full of turkey, surrounded by other survivors, he felt something almost like peace. The war hadn't destroyed him completely. There was still self left, still capability for feeling, still possibility of living rather than just surviving. That seemed like Christmas miracle as much as anything biblical. Klaus had never experienced Christmas like this. Not the abundance, not the kindness, not the sense of community across enemy lines. At 14, his previous Christmases had all been wartime Christmases, marked by scarcity and fear and propaganda. This American Christmas, given to German prisoners by people who had every reason to hate them, demonstrated something about grace and humanity that no propaganda could match. He'd remember this meal for the rest of his life, would measure all future kindness against this standard, would carry forward the lesson that mercy mattered more than vengeance. That evening, the boys gathered in their barracks and sang German carols, Still Nacht, O Tannenbaum, Vom Himmel Ho, songs that connected them to culture and history deeper than the regime's brief poisonous 12 years. The American Guard stood outside listening, some joining in with English versions of the same melodies, music bridging what politics had divided. It was a small moment, unremarkable in broader war narrative, but for the boys experiencing it, it felt transformative proof that humanity could survive hatred, that culture transcended politics, that enemies could find common ground in shared melodies. Spring 1946 brought news of repatriation beginning. The boys would return to Germany gradually as logistics and politics aligned, sent back to occupied zones, released to families if families could be located, placed in reconstruction programs if families had disappeared. The process would take months, maybe years, but it was beginning captivity at an endpoint now, however uncertain. Dieter received notification in April that he'd be in the first group of juvenile POWs repatriated. He'd be sailing from New York in May, traveling to Bremen, and making his way to wherever Dresden had become. He felt conflicted wanting to go home, dreading what home had become, grateful for captivity that had been education as much as imprisonment, sad to leave place that had shown him humans could be decent across every division. His last day at Camp Tonkawa, Captain Morrison called him to the administrative office. A captain handed him a letter of reference official document stating Dieter had been model prisoner, had learned English, had worked diligently, possessed skills that would be valuable in reconstruction. You did well here, Morrison said through the translator. You adapted, you learned, you maintained your dignity despite difficult circumstances. Germany will need young men like you to rebuild. Take what you learned here about cooperation and apply it to making sure your country never goes down this path again. Dieter took the letter with trembling hands. Thank you, sir, he said in careful English. You showed us mercy when you didn't have to. You treated us like humans when we were enemies. I will remember that. I will try to be that kind of person. Morrison nodded, his own emotions visible despite professional composure. Go home, son, he said. Make something good out of what you survived. The ship departed New York in May, carrying Dieter and 300 other German POWs back across the Atlantic to a Europe that had been transformed by 6 years of total war. Dieter stood at the rail, watching America disappear into ocean distance, thinking about chocolate bars and English classes in Christmas turkey, and all the small mercies that had challenged every certainty he'd been taught. He was going home to ruins, but he was going with knowledge that enemies could be decent, that propaganda could be comprehensively false, that futures could be built on truth rather than ideology. Hans returned to Hamburg in June 1946 and found his family alive, but barely mother, younger sister, living in 2 rooms of a bombed building, surviving on Allied rations and black market trading. His father had died in 1944. His older brother was missing and presumed lost. But this fragment of family remained and welcomed him with tears and relief. He told them about Oklahoma, about Camp Tonkawa, about Americans who treated German children with mercy, despite having every reason for vengeance. His mother wept listening, grateful her son had survived, grateful enemies had been kind, ashamed that Germany had made enemies of people who could have been friends. Hans used his kitchen skills learned in captivity to find work with British occupation forces, cooking for military personnel, contributing to reconstruction while learning additional English. He eventually opened his own restaurant in the 1950s, serving German food with American techniques learned from Sergeant Martinez, building business that thrived in post-war Germany's economic recovery. He kept Captain Morrison's letter of reference framed on his office wall, reminder of mercy received and lesson about how victors could treat defeated without degradation. Klaus returned to his family in September 1946, last of the Camp Tonkawa boys to be repatriated due to his age requiring additional documentation. His parents had survived in their village outside Munich, and they held him like he might disappear if they released their grip. He told them everything: the capture, the train ride to Oklahoma, the chocolate bar, the English classes, the library work, the Christmas dinner. His mother listened with hand over her mouth, tears streaming, horrified by what her 14-year-old son had experienced, but grateful he'd survived. Grateful. The Americans had been devastated that her country had put children in uniform and sent them to war. Klaus became teacher using education he'd received in captivity as foundation for university study, eventually teaching German and English in Munich schools, dedicating career to ensuring next generation learned cooperation and truth rather than propaganda and hatred. He spoke rarely about his POW experience, but when he did, he emphasized the mercy shown by enemies who treated him better than his own regime had. That lesson, he believed, was essential for Germany's Reconstruction, learning that power didn't require cruelty, that strength could coexist with compassion, that treating enemies humanely was demonstration of values rather than weakness. Dieter Koch lived until 2007, dying at age 77, having built successful career as civil engineer, having helped reconstruct the Dresden that Allied bombing and Soviet occupation had transformed beyond recognition. He married, raised children, told them selective stories about the war that emphasized survival and mercy without dwelling on trauma or ideology. His grandchildren knew Opa had been prisoner of war in America, knew he spoke excellent English learned in captivity, knew he'd always insisted that enemies could become friends if people chose decency over hatred. Among his possessions after his death, his children found the chocolate wrapper from that first day at Tonkawa Station Sergeant Davis's Hershey bar, wrapper carefully preserved for 62 years, flattened and stored in an envelope marked First Day in America. With it was a letter Dieter had never mailed, written in 1985 to Captain Morrison, who died 3 years earlier. Expressing gratitude, Dieter had never quite managed to convey directly. You treated us like humans when we were technically enemies. You gave us education when you could have used us for labor. You showed mercy when vengeance would have been understandable. You demonstrated that victory doesn't require brutality, that power can coexist with compassion, that even in warfare's aftermath, decency remains possible. Thank you for that lesson. It shaped everything I became. The Camp Tonkawa facility closed in 1946, its mission completed, its prisoners repatriated. The buildings were repurposed or demolished, the land returned to other uses. Physical evidence of what happened there gradually erased by time and neglect. But the legacy persisted in men like Dieter and Hans and Klaus, in the thousands of juvenile posts who been treated with mercy when cruelty would have been easier, who learned that enemies could be decent, who carried forward lessons about cooperation and dignity that helped rebuild Germany from ideology as ashes. The chocolate bar wasn't strategic military decision. The English classes weren't required by Geneva Conventions. The Christmas dinner exceeded minimum standards for POW treatment. These were choices made by Americans who recognized that children were children, regardless of uniforms, that defeating an enemy regime didn't require destroying its people, that showing mercy to the young might plant seeds of understanding that would grow into peace more lasting than military victory could impose. Dieter had expected torture and received chocolate. That single moment of unexpected mercy on an Oklahoma train platform in March 1945 began transformation that took decades to complete, but started immediately. The recognition that propaganda had been systematically false, that Americans weren't savages, that enemies were humans who could choose decency despite every justification for hatred. That recognition multiplied across thousands of juvenile prisoners, across millions of Germans learning that Allied occupation brought justice rather than vengeance, helped transform Germany from defeated enemy to democratic ally within a generation. The boys who stepped off that train at Camp Tonkawa carried propaganda certainties and war's traumas. The young men who sailed home months later carried different knowledge that mercy was possible even in victory, that education could continue even in captivity, that humanity persisted despite systems designed to erase it, that sometimes the most devastating weapon wasn't violence, but kindness that challenged everything you'd been taught about enemies and power, and what it meant to be victorious without being cruel. 75 years later, the chocolate wrapper remains in a museum display about juvenile POWs and American treatment of child soldiers. Visitors read the explanation about 15-year-old German conscript who expected torture and received candy about first day in captivity that challenged lifetime of propaganda about mercy, shown across enemy lines that echoed through decades and helped transform nations from wartime enemies to peacetime allies. The wrapper itself is fragile, faded, barely holding together after 3/4 of a century. But what it represents, the possibility of choosing decency despite justification for hatred, remains. As relevant as the day Sergeant Davis reached into his pocket and handed chocolate to a terrified boy in an enemy uniform on an Oklahoma train platform in the spring of 1945.